My name is Sanja Karilanova. Today I'll talk about our paper on state-space model-inspired multiple input, multiple output spiking neurons. This is a work that I have done with my two PhD supervisors, Subrakanti and Aija, and we are coming from Uppsala University in Sweden. My presentation will follow 4 different sections, starting from background and methods, and then talking about results and conclusions. I'll begin by positioning our work in the current literature. So on the left side, we have state-space models. They have been in the core of areas such as signal processing and signal control, but lately they have given a very promising results in long sequence modeling, given to the level of transformers. Due to their linear nature, they have a linear computational complexity along the length of the sequence. This is unlike transformers, which have quadratic computational complexity. And due to this linear model, we are able to do parallelization and to compute it in parallel along the sequence. They are quite general in the linear field. However, in the cost of their performance, we always have to propagate a continuous valued function. On the other hand, we have spiking neurons, which are assumed familiar to most people here. We use them for sequence modeling. They have a recurrent nonlinearity in the form of a reset, and due to this, we cannot parallelize them. They are usually neuron-inspired dynamics, so some of their features are connected to neuron elements such as the memory potential. One of the good things about them is that they're spike-based, so there's only a spike when there's an event happening. Our work bridges the two, and we use inspiration from state-space models, and we propose a general linear state-space models with multi-input and multi-output spiking neurons. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, what I mean by saying multi-input and multi-output, here on the left side, we have a typical spiking neural network, which takes a weighted average of the input sequences and accepts only one input sequence to its state and outputs one output sequence. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, we have multi-input, which accepts information directly to the state from multiple sequences and outputs or projects the information of its state in multiple outputs. Next, I'll talk about methods. First, I'll start by talking about a general spiking neuron model. Then I will compare it to a state-space model. And finally, this will hopefully pave the way in order for me to introduce the proposed models. So here on the left side, we have a typical leaf neuron, which I assume is familiar to all of us. How I have defined here is that Y is the memory potential, alpha is the leak of the memory potential from the previous time step. We have alpha T, which parameterizes the output spike from the previous time step, and 1 minus alpha parameterizes the input to the neuron. So as I said, S out for me is the output of this neuron from the previous time step, which can be a simple threshold function. Here on the right-hand side, I have a more general neuron where the state now is n-dimensional vector, which again has a state transition through A. It's parameterizing the output from the previous time step and the input as well. And we can find the output S out based on the state. So there is a direct correspondence between the two following the colors. And as we can see, the leaf neuron is a special one-dimensional case of the right-hand side, more general neuron. Now we move to a bit more complicated neuron, which is the adaptive leaf neuron, which has one additional variable known as the adaptive variable. The membrane and the adaptive variable are intertangled in the first two equations, and then we use the membrane potential in order to get an output spike. These dynamics, the first two sequences, can be rewritten in a matrix form as follows, shown here, where we just stack the state variables. So here is the matrix from the previous slide. So we can see that this, again, is a two-dimensional special case of the general spiking neuron, where now we have two-dimension instead of the n-dimension, and there is a direct correspondence between the two following the colors in the table here. Okay, so now that we have the more general spiking model, I'm going to compare it with state space models. So on the left side, we have the general spiking model that we were talking about earlier. Remember that there, the input is a scalar, and the output is a scalar as well, so it's either 1 or 0. On the right-hand side here, we have a typical state space model in discrete form. So similarly, it has a state variable, v, which is a vector. It has a state transition, which explains how the internal dynamics works in the system. It has b, which parameterizes the input. And then the output is a linear combination of the state variable v itself and the input. Now, if we compare these two, we can see a few similarities as well as a few differences. Similarities are the A and the B matrices, while main differences are that in the SSMs, we do not have a reset, so there is not a nonlinear feedback. Another difference is that here we have a linear output. And a third difference is the dimension of the system. So here in the SSMs, we no longer constrain the input and the output to be scalars, but the input can be, for example, a vector of n in, or the number of input channels, and the output can be a vector of n out, or the number of output channels. Okay, our work combines the two in the following way. So in our models, we have, again, a state variable v, here is shown with green, which goes through a state transition matrix A. And then at every time step, we have an input that gets parameterized through the matrix B. And then the state itself produces a preliminary output. How it's produced is going through the C matrix through Y. So that is the second dimension, the second equation here. And then only after we have this preliminary output of the mixed state variable through C and C bias, we produce output spikes, and that is N out, or the number of output channels. Now, if I compare, so here on the left side is the proposed model that I talked about. Now, if we compare that to the more general spiking neuron, we can see that we did a few things differently. So the first one is that we do not have nonlinear feedback. We do not have a reset anymore. Another difference is that now we have a preliminary output which mixes with C. It mixes all the state variables and adds a bias before we compute the spikes. This is different to the more general spiking model, which computes the spikes directly from the state variable themselves. And another difference is the dimensions, that now we allow for multiple input and for multiple output. So this is the neuron that we were talking about. Now the question is, how do we build networks out of this? Well, that's done simply by stacking these neurons in a layer, as shown here on the right-hand side, where every output channel of every neuron of the previous layer gets connected to every input channel in every neuron in the next layer. And this is done through a dense weight connection matrix. So having that kind of structure, there are multiple research questions that arise. Some of them is what's the connection between how big the state dimension of the neuron is and how many neurons we use, and whether there's a trade-off between the two. Second question can be, what should the matrices look like in this model? So A, B, and C, and similar. The third question is, what should be the number of input and output channels? Fourth would be, how much do we lose if we lose anything in the performance when we use a spiking function instead of continuous valued function? And the final one would be, can we compensate if there is loss in performance by using multiple output? We tried to answer some of these research questions in our results, but before I move to the results, I will quickly talk about some of the experimental setup that we had. One thing is that when I'll mention activation function, what I mean is the function that is applied here on the preliminary output Y in order to produce the spikes. Specifically in our work, we used 3 different activation functions. So we used the simple 0-1 spiking function here with red, so zeros and then 1, and that we called a non-sign spike function. Then we also use a function which allows for a sign, so it's -1 and then 0 and then 1, and this we called a sign spike function. We also use a gel continuous function, which is mainly a benchmark in our results. Another thing that I'll be mentioning is the state transition matrix, whether it's diagonal or non-diagonal. And what I mean by that is this matrix here. So in the case when it's a diagonal, that means that when the hidden state or the state variables go through the state transformation, they are not coupled with each other, they're independent, while when we have a non-diagonal, their interaction is allowed. Another thing is that we will use different types of models based on the input and the output dimensions. And what I mean by this is that apart from the single input, single output and multi-input, multi-output that I talked before in previous slide, we will also use a hybrid of the two, which is single input, multi-output and multi-input, single output neurons. In all of the models that I'll talk about, we use 2 hidden layers. They're trained with backpropagation through time with surrogate gradient over 30 epochs. And the performances that I'll show will be on the SHD dataset, which is a keyword dataset where classification of digit is the objective. Okay. So the first result that I'm going to show is a result which explores the trade-off between how many neurons we use and the state dimension of them. So here, H is the number of neurons in the hidden layers, while N is the state dimension of them. And specifically, we keep H times N constant. So H times N is 2048. This means that, for example, in the first row here, what we have is hidden layers where we have 1024 neurons, and each is of dimension 2, while this is similar to the ADLIF and the LIF models, because as you remember, they were 1 or 2 dimensional. While in the last row, we have a situation where we have only 2 neurons in the layers, but they are of very large dimension, and that is of 1024. We can see that the performance is higher for the first rows, which means that even though the neurons are of low dimensions, so even though they're not able to capture all of the features and dynamics that is happening in the data, they're able to communicate this with many other neurons. While in the last rows, we have neurons that are able to capture this rich dynamics. However, there's not enough neurons to communicate this with. And this also further makes sense given that for this experiment, we use single input, single output, and we use spiking function. So even though there are 2 neurons, it's further constrained by only communicating low bit communication between the neurons. The next result that I will talk about is is varying the input and output channel. So in this table, on the second column, we state what input dimension we used for each neuron, while on the third column, we talk about what output dimension we used. I will use colors in order to indicate what specific rows I'm focusing on at the moment. So for example, here we compare single input in both cases, where we have single output, or we have multiple output. And when we compare the two, we can see that when we use 64 or 128 output dimension, we can notice increase in accuracy. This might be explained due to the fact that using multiple output can be seen as trading off the having an amplitude of spike resolution on the projecting it in the spatial dimension by having multiple outputs. The next one is we compare now multiple input in both cases, but single output, multiple input with single outputs. And we here see that we have a degradation performance. This can be explained by the fact that perhaps since we do not diversify the output, we still have single output, but we have multi-output. That means that the output will overuse the input and where there's not enough diversity. Another reason might be that we have not specifically we have only done very constrained hyperparameter optimization for this case, and also judging by the high standard deviation, further regularization might be needed in this case. Similar things can be also noticed when we use multi-input, multi-output, and degradation in performance, which is expected to be improved by HPO or regularization. Next, I will talk about the combined effects of multiple of the design choices that we did in our experiments. So before we look into the results, I will just quickly introduce this table. So in the first column, what we vary is the state transition, whether we use diagonal or non-diagonal. In the second column, what we vary is whether we use single output or 128 output channels. In the third column, we vary the activation functions that we use. So we use the 3 that I mentioned before. So there are multiple things that we can notice from this table. I will go one by one. So for example, one thing that we can notice is that when we compare, for example, the first 2 rows, so diagonal with diagonal, we see increase in performance. So comparing the first row here with the third and the corresponding ones based on the activation function. Similar thing can be also noticed in the non-diagonal cases, where again, there is an increase in performance comparing the corresponding rows. So what this means is that in multiple output helped us in terms of performance in the cases where we had both diagonal state transitions. So that means that the state variables were decoupled, were not interacting, as well as in the non-diagonal case where they were interacting with each other in the state transition phase. Another thing we can notice is that, first of all, just a recap that this is the case. So here I focus on the case where we have a low H. So the number of neurons is 32, while the state dimension of the neuron is 64. So this was not the most optimal case. However, we decided to focus on this case because this is the case where the neurons are rich in dynamics and the communication between them is the bottleneck. And then we can see the true difference of varying the parameters. So in this case, there is a true bottleneck in terms of the communication because we have only 32 hidden neurons. And that indeed shows here by the fact that in every single combination of the models, when we compare the non-signed activation function, which is 1 bit, with the signed activation function, which is 2-bit, there is a clear increase in performance. So here from 79 to 83 or from 86 to 89. So this makes sense given that including this extra bit allows for more communication, so for more information to be conveyed from one neuron to the next in this constrained communication model. Another thing that we can think about in this table is how the state variables are coupled with each other. So as I said before, one way to couple them is in the state transition itself by using non-diagonal one. That means comparing, for example, here the first row, the diagonal single input, single output. So the blue with the light blue, the non-diagonal. And in that case, when we compare the two, we can see that similar level of performance have been obtained in both cases. So this means that coupling them in the state transition in the way that we have coupled them achieved the same level of performance. Of course, this is dependent on what kind of structure you use and how you couple them. Apart from coupling them in the state transition itself, another way to couple them is the multi-output, because we perform the multi-output in the preliminary output just before the activation function is applied. So this means that we do mixing of the state variables before the activation function. These are some of the results that we also talked about, but when we compare the single output with the multi-output, then we see a clear increase of performance. So this way of linear coupling in terms of output dimension, it helped the performance. So that's part of the results that we looked at. Some of the things that we can conclude is that there are many proposed type of models in the literature. We contribute to this line of work when we proposed a state space model inspired multiple output, multiple input neuron. And in this work, our results show that we can achieve similar level of performance when we compare it to ad-leaf and leaf type of networks in models where there's no data augmentation or similar level of parameters. In those cases, there is a comparable performance. Another thing that we looked at is trade-off among various design choices for the models, such as the state size of the neuron versus how many number of neurons we used, what the number of input and the output channels, as well as the activation function and the quantization levels of the activation function itself. One conclusion that can be that is clear and can be drawn is that in models, when we had large state dimension and low number of neurons, multiple output helped and may improve the performance significantly. Future work can, for example, constitute of doing more hyperparameter optimization, because as I mentioned, this was very constrained in our work. Another thing is to look into different ways of structures of the weight matrices. It can be also more how this can be applied to the hardware. Yes, and many others. But with this, I can conclude my talk.